You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 3rd of September 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 1 a.m. in Ulaanbaatar, 2000 in Jerusalem, 1800 here in London and 1300 in Washington, D.C. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. The UK clips a minuscule amount from Israel's defence budget. Mongolia resists calls to sling a prominent guest in the Husgau. And Sweden wants to keep sentiment out of weddings. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Ben Kelly and Tessa Shishkovitz will discuss the day's big stories, and in another of our interviews recorded at the GlobeSec Forum in Prague, we'll discuss the Middle East with Dr. Mansour Al-Mazoki of the Prince Saud Al Faisal Institute for Diplomatic Studies in Riyadh. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Ben Kelly, Senior Audience Editor at Newsweek, and by Tessa Shishkovitz, UK correspondent for the Austrian weekly magazine Falter, also author of Echte Engländer, Britain and Brexit. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Ben, I understand that you have recently been attempting to persuade yourself, if nobody else, that Ireland, for all its other manifold blessings, is actually any sort of place anybody would ever seriously think about going swimming.
Yeah, well, cold water swimming really is cold there. That's what I'll say.
Is any other kind of swimming actually available in Ireland?
Not that I've found so far. This was my first endeavour. Unfortunately for me, I don't come from Australia, Andrew. We don't have the sunny climes that you guys enjoy. But I gave it a dip anyway, and it was actually good. Yeah, it felt really good in the end.
Really? This isn't one of those, I've stopped so it feels good?
Yeah, with hindsight, it may have been that, yeah.
Tessa, you have recently been going, I guess, somewhere not necessarily cold at this time of year, but at least alpine?
Yes, because I went to a European forum in Alpbach, which is in Austria, in the mountains. And it's an excellent, it's a little bit the Austrian Davos kind of idea, pro-European setting, which is also not always a given in Austria. And when you have people discussing, for example, if the EU should speak with a common voice on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then it's very good to be in the mountains, because whenever, temperature goes up between combatants, you can say, okay, let's take a look at the view for a moment.
And did you manage to sort everything out while you were up there or not?
Absolutely.
Oh,
I
well
think
done.
we should just hand over to the 20-year-olds and they would say, go ahead with a few sort of radical measures that might, in the end, give everyone human rights and a state.
Well, we will begin on a related subject with the UK's mild rebuke to Israel in the form of the suspension of some arms sales. Specifically, the UK has put on ice 30 of 350 currently operating arms export licenses to Israel, affecting equipment which Israel may be deploying in Gaza, very possibly, as the UK's government sees it, in violation of international law. UK Foreign Minister David Lammy was careful to note, however, that this is neither an arms embargo nor dispute of Israel's right to defend itself. Despite what is apparently believed by a noisy cohort of the British left, the UK is presently a tiny contributor to Israel's military, just £18.2 million worth in 2023. Ben, is this fundamentally a symbolic gesture?
I think you can only see it as such. It's not going to make a huge impact on Israel's performance, as the UK government have themselves prefaced. Despite the anger that's coming from Netanyahu, it's almost the sort of usual performance that he's been giving back to a lot of his allies when they have curtailed or sort of chastised Israel over the past 12 months.
We should note that several other countries have already curtailed such things to a certain extent: Canada, Spain, Belgium and the Netherlands.
Yeah, absolutely. And yet, the US, who is by far the biggest arms supplier, has boosted them further by some 26 billion at the last count. And there are other countries who continue to provide Israel with arms, Germany, Denmark, with far fewer restrictions than the countries that you just mentioned. So it really doesn't make that much of a difference. It is a bit of symbolism. I think that David Lammy wants to be seen to be an upholder of international law, and he wants Labour to be at the forefront of that. I think by the same token, Keir Starmer does have certain parts of the left and Labour that he wants to sort of maybe appease to, even though he has sort of given up their support and their votes going back to the election in July. But nevertheless, I think he wants to be seen to be on the right side of things, certainly being a bit more balanced, as a lot of European countries are.
It does, of course, mean, Tessa, that 320 arms export licences to Israel will proceed, at least for the moment, unaffected. If we are agreed, and I think we are, that this is a symbolic gesture, is it nevertheless one worth making?
I think there's a real change in atmosphere that we will see also in the coming years. You know, this Gaza war is really decisive, I think, to change the attitude towards Israel now and also in the future. Not that people will stop supplying arms to Israel to defend itself. I think that's a really solid commitment that, for example, Germany has, and Germany is sort of the second biggest also arms deliverer to Israel now. Although the Germans don't directly deliver arms, they sort of give point-by-point decisions if a company is allowed to export a particular item. But nevertheless, I think that the idea that these really serious acts of war crimes that are being committed now in Gaza towards the Palestinian civilian population, that there are some arms that will not go out to Israel anymore is, you know, it's really a change in strategy and in politics. And I think that also we will see over the coming months, more debate within the European Union institutions and leaders how to proceed and how to find also a more common position towards this conflict as such.
Ben, I just wanted to pick up on something you were saying about the motives for the Labour government for doing this, that it might appease those on its left who have been extremely unhappy about the UK's support for Israel. But could it start a row within Labour facing in the other direction? Because there's been a statement today from Labour Friends of Israel, which is what it says it is, which says, among other things, we are deeply concerned by the signal this sends to Iran, the world's leading sponsor of state terrorism and Vladimir Putin's closest ally in Ukraine. We fear that these restrictions risk encouraging Israel's enemies, leading to greater escalation rather than de-escalation.
Yeah, and as you say, that comes from within the Labour Party itself, and that's sort of balanced out on the other side by, for example, the Labour MP Zara Sultana, who was pointing out that some of the arms that are still going there are the parts for the F-35 fighter jets, which are seen as being some of the most lethal in the world. The question there is, how does Keir Starmer measure up the support within his party on both of those sides, right? How much do you value both of those things? I think you can only be trapped somewhere in the middle, trying to do a fair job, but ultimately maybe pleasing neither.
We have heard from Benjamin Netanyahu, Tessa, whose reaction was predictable, but is he entirely wrong when he points out that Hamas did murder 14 British citizens last October 7th and is still believed to be holding at least 5 British hostages? Is he not entitled to a bit more support from, well, the country of those people?
The country does. So Israel gets the support of the UK. It's not that Keir Starmer now is taking the support for Israel away and is diplomatically now changing course drastically. But I think the idea that not only in the Labour Party but also in the population, among very many young people, the feeling is that the Israeli government is not a government that one should maybe support without any question. And that does not mean that anyone supports Hamas. I mean, Hamas is for the UK on the list of terrorist organizations. So we're not talking about sort of being one-sidedly now critical of Israel. People are highly critical of Hamas. Nobody thinks Hamas is sort of, a human rights group. So I would also caution I heard, for example, the chief rabbi of the UK today also being very critical of this decision. But I think you don't want to necessarily contribute with every means to a conflict. And I think it's within the right of democratic governments in the European sphere, in the Western world, also to say, like, we do want to support Israel if Iran attacks it. We do not necessarily want to support Israel in killing civilians in the Gaza Strip, children and women. And that, I think, is a debate that's also very worth having.
Ben, just finally on this, it is also a noteworthy gesture by the UK's government in that it is a clear break with the previous UK government, and it's a bit of a break with the United States. I mean, for reasons we have been discussing, where military supplies to Israel are concerned, the United States is obviously the ball game. Is it too much to anticipate, though, that their attitude might start to change? We have, and we did chronicle this process in an episode of the Foreign Desk quite recently, we have seen a sort of gradually dwindling patience with Israel from the Biden administration in particular.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Not sure I have the exact answer, but I think a lot of people, we were discussing this just among my colleagues at Newsweek today, of whether this will put any pressure on Kamala Harris to be more specific in her going forwards with Israel, and whether she would follow suit in any of those weapons. I'm not sure that's going to happen particularly, but it's something that she will have to perhaps be questioned on in the coming months, weeks even at this point. But I did see one of Trump's former national security advisors speaking over the weekend, sort of warning the UK not to break the special relationship, because whether it's Trump or Harris, they're going to continue to back Israel pretty much as they have been.
Well, let's now turn our gaze towards Mongolia, which is presently hosting Russian President Vladimir Putin. This would not, in happier times, be an especially big whoop. Mongolia is right next door to Russia, and this is indeed Putin's fourth visit as president. However, it is the first time since the International Criminal Court issued a warrant for Putin's arrest that he has set foot in a country which is a member of the ICC, and therefore, depending on how rigidly applies the obligations of the Rome Statute, arguably obliged to nick him. As of this broadcast, however, Putin's collar remains unfelt by Ulaanbaatar's finest. Tessa, in theory at least, we'll get to grips with the practicalities shortly, but in theory, should Mongolia in fact run him in?
Well, in theory, yes, but as we heard from the government in Ulaanbaatar, that they get 95% of their petroleum products from Russia,
which is not an inconsequential consideration.
Not inconsequential, and so I don't think. First of all, of course, Putin must have checked carefully how they would react, and it was quite clear that they would not arrest him. And maybe the expectation was also not so very high that they would do so. But in principle, yes, they should have done that, and in principle Putin should also not be still sitting in the Kremlin and leading a war against the Ukraine.
No, he should in theory be in the clink in Ulaanbaatar, but there are obvious practical problems with this, and do you think that should be acknowledged and understood by Mongolia's fellow ICC members, that it is frankly especially given Mongolia's general situation, not just its energy dependence on Russia, but Mongolia's whole thing forever has basically been huddling between Russia and China and basically hoping that both Russia and China kind of forget they're there.
Well, this is where, your sort of major international organisations come up against it, because there are all these nuances. There are countries that have certain dependencies or are afraid to speak out about neighbours and so on. And countries like China and Russia then sort of manage to sort of exert a sort of silent veto over certain things, whether it's the UN or the ICC or whatever. And yeah, just to expand on the quote that Tessa was reading, the Mongolian government actually said, the supply is crucial to secure our existence. This is existential for them. They're not going to, do over Putin, because they need to just make sure that they can survive as a country. So some things come above following international standards. And I think for these guys, keeping their heads down and surviving is right up there, or else, who knows who could be the next Ukraine, put it like that. I
mean, all that being considered, and I'm not quite sure what the back and forth traffic in setting this visit up was, but Tessa, should Mongolia have maybe said, couldn't this meeting be more of an email?
Yeah, but maybe they had no choice. I think that Putin likes to show that he can go and travel to some countries outside of Russia, and that was a pretty close one for him. I remember I went once with the Trans-Siberian train from Moscow via Ulaanbaatar to Beijing.
I have done the same trip.
You see. And so you know how you don't want to necessarily upset one of those neighbors if you're a Mongolian.
Indeed not. Somebody Mongolia has upset, Ben, perhaps unsurprisingly, is Ukraine, who have not taken this well. And I quote, Mongolia allowed the indicted criminal to escape justice, thereby sharing responsibility for his war crimes. We will work with partners to ensure that this has consequences for Ulaanbaatar. Now, obviously, Ukraine has every reason in the world to be outraged by any impression of giving haven, sanctuary or hospitality to Russia, not least on the day that at least 51 people reported dead in a missile strike on a military facility in Ukraine near Poltava. But does this help Ukraine sort of teeing off at Mongolia like this?
I don't think it really matters on the scheme of things. I'm not sure there's much love lost. I mean, I was looking back and, when the UN voted to condemn Russia's invasion in 2022, Mongolia abstained. So, they haven't been fast friends for a couple of years now. So I expect that's very much a diplomatic necessity for Ukraine to put that out today. I'm not sure it's going to be something that's high up on their agenda come tomorrow.
I mean, and just finally on this, Tessa, and with all due acknowledgement of the risks of attempting to predict the future, what would we say from here the chances are that we ever see what the ideal outcome of the ICC's warrant would be, i.e. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin in a dock in The Hague answering for his crimes?
Well, we had these theoretical questions about a few other leaders, and we didn't think that Milosevic, the Serbian president, would ever make it there. So we should wait and see. I mean, it's of course not very likely from where we're sitting here now in the studio in London to predict these things, but I wouldn't rule it out. I think in principle, with all, we are sort of half-jokingly asking Mongolia to arrest Putin for the ICC. Okay, so that's not happening, but the principle that you have an international criminal court that looks at, crimes that a state commits against an ethnic group or another state. That is something. In the case of Putin, he was indicted for having stolen children from the Ukraine. I mean, these are things where we really have to look case by case and be quite happy that this court exists, even if it cannot always bring the people to the actual courtroom. But it helps also reputational a little bit to see who are the bad guys.
Well, let's move on somewhat, and listeners in most developed countries will be wearily familiar with the contours of the inane binary debate around immigration. Those broadly opposed to immigration will not admit that any immigrants might well prove enormous assets to their new country. Those broadly in favour of immigration will not acknowledge that any might actually be actual or potential malefactors that any country would be better off without. Austria is attempting to find a balance following Germany's lead in deporting Afghans with criminal records back whence they came, despite the obviously suboptimal state of affairs in their homeland. Tessa, speaking as the Austrian at the table, where has the debate on this in Austria tracked? I mean, has it been the same as everywhere else? Is the government doing this to try and shut up the anti-immigrant right, or is there actually a problem with crimes committed by people from Afghanistan and these people have been convicted and Austria has decided they're not our problem anymore?
Well, there are strong similarities now to the German debate, which is a bit more familiar to the international debate than the debate in Austria, which is a smaller, more insignificant country. But the similarities are that, you have this rising knife crime in cities where gangs are either gangs or individuals go against each other with knives. That scares, of course, people, and rightly so. The question is, do you blame all the refugees or asylum seekers for it? And it happens in Germany because some of the cases now involved Syrian or Afghan citizens who partly had or didn't have the right to stay in Germany. And in Austria, there are similar cases like that. And what also is a similarity is we also have elections. So in Germany, you had regional elections. In Austria, at the end of this month, you have federal elections. And so the pressure is very, very high. And like in these East German regions in Germany, in Austria, the far-right FPÖ party is polling around 27 to 30% of the votes. So, of course, the center parties then, as they do in Germany, are then trying to please these anti-immigration feelings by fueling it with the idea that you can deport at least refugees or asylum seekers who are committing crimes. So it's not about, deporting anyone that you want, but special cases. And in Austria, there's one special case where this summer the Constitutional Court has ruled that one young man could be legally deported to Afghanistan, which I have to say I was very surprised about this because according to the European Convention of Human Rights, you should not actually deport people to countries that are as radically unsafe as Afghanistan is. But it was said that he had sort of enough of a structure to be supported by his family or something. It's a legal opinion that was confirmed by the highest court in Austria. So things are changing on the political level for sure, but also on the legal level. And that will certainly become stronger in Germany and in Austria and in some of the other countries. So I think we see a change of this relatively successful campaign by far-right parties to undermine the international rule of law that we were used to.
Ben, as an abstract principle, though, is there necessarily anything wrong with a given country saying effectively to a given criminal, you broke the law, you committed a serious crime, if conditions in your homeland are dangerous and unpleasant, that's not really our problem at this point?
Well, quite. If they're making the conditions dangerous and unpleasant in the country they've come to, then, I don't have all that much sympathy for those people. But what confuses me here is what has changed in Afghanistan that suddenly Germany and Austria thinks, oh, well, it wasn't all right a few years ago when the Taliban took over, but now it's looking a bit sunnier. I mean, nothing has changed. Have I missed something?
No, you have not. And further to that, I mean, Amnesty International have been predictably critical of it. They have noted that in Afghanistan there are, and they're not wrong, extrajudicial executions, enforced disappearances, torture and systematic subjugation of girls and women. But I guess to amplify the question I previously asked, is a given country not within its rights to say to a given criminal, well, maybe you should have thought of that?
I think you should be, yes. And I think a lot of people across Europe would agree with that. And that's some of what you're seeing at the polls, some of what you're seeing in public opinion. And it's obviously a conversation that has to be had. It's beginning here with Germany and Austria, and it's beginning at the easier end of the wedge, as it were, criminals. And especially at a time when there have been a few very high-profile knife cases, as Tessa said. So they're sort of dipping their toe into this and hopefully getting some positive public opinion back from it is what I expect that they're hoping for, and then seeing where it goes from there.
I mean, is there a concern there, though, Tessa, that this instinct to just round people up and deport them back to where they came from, however unpleasant it is, might accelerate? That, as Ben suggests, you start with people convicted of dreadful violent crimes, and I think standing up on their behalf will be a very minority pursuit. But then you start thinking, well, OK, we got rid of them. Who's next?
No, absolutely. And, I don't think anyone has particular sympathy with these 28 individuals who were deported from Germany to Afghanistan with the help of Qatar. All these things are also extremely complicated. There was money involved to get them out of the country. It's extremely expensive also to deport people. So next to the legal question, if that's a good idea, you should also think about if it's actually makes sense in terms of paying taxpayer money for these relatively absurd flights home. And then, so the criminals that were deported, who were involved in raping children in Germany, I mean, that's really, there's no sympathy individually or personally that I would have for anyone there. But these guys will be we don't know what will happen to them in Afghanistan. And if they roam freely in Kabul, it's not something where I would think like we can also, our consciousness can take this, that guys are being deported just somewhere else where then they rape women. I mean, there must be a little bit more of a consideration if this is only about the safety of German streets or Austrian streets, or this is also concerning other people anywhere else in the world.
Well, let's take a look now at Sweden, where harumphing Lutherans are vexed by a gathering fashion among Swedish brides to be given away by their fathers, a behaviour apparently learned from watching American and British television and movies. Sweden's Lutheran tradition has generally and arguably commendably abjured this flagrantly patriarchal demonstration of handover, preferring the bride and groom to walk down the aisle side by side like two grown adults deserving of an equal crack at the remote control. A pitch has been made by people who care about any of this to church authorities to ban the whole giving away thing. Ben, are you consumed by passionate beliefs one way or the other on this?
No, but I will say,
could you pretend to be for the purposes of this broadcast?
Well, I'm very surprised that in countries where we're sort of getting rid of patriarchal, old-fashioned views and things like that in Sweden, of all places, they'd be adopting them. I find that very surprising. And yeah, I think you're right. I think it is the influence of American television, which, we can debate whether that's a positive or a negative thing until the end of the show, I imagine. But no, I don't feel strongly one way or the other. I do think it comes down to personal choice. I think a ban is a bit extreme. I think if you want to be given away by your father or your mother or whatever, then that should be all right. But it does seem an odd thing to be adopting into your culture when it has never been there before.
Yeah, I tend towards the sort of belief that as long as all the correct paperwork has been filed, the rest of it is entirely up to the couple concerned. I'm thinking now of the memory of my younger brother's wedding, where there was no bridal party whatsoever, there was no speech from any best man, and the only bridesmaid was their English Mastiff.
But you see,
there was a barbecue as well.
Oh, that's also...
Was there a bride? Was there a bride? I'm very confused by that story.
There was, in fact, a bride.
Okay, that sounds not so bad.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the interesting bit is, of course, that the Swedish tradition of this kind of Protestant church, Lutheran church that usually you go to in Sweden, is that they walk together, groom and bride, hand in hand, if you already go to a church. I mean, who does a thing like this nowadays? So it's of course up to everyone to do what they want, but the Swedes definitely had a very good tradition in that. So it would be interesting also to see the numbers. And you know that Sweden often has this idea to ban things because it actually sometimes helps society to move forward progressively for women. So I'm not totally against the idea that you say to people, okay, so we're not starting this now, but I think you can't really interfere in this kind of, if somebody wants a rather old-fashioned custom, then having their father walking them down the aisle, to prevent that by a ban, by law, I think that would also lead maybe to a backlash. And I think it's really sort of a model that is definitely in Sweden or in Europe probably running out as a little backlash, maybe coming from TV series from the States, but it's not very likely that that will be a mass movement now in Sweden.
Well, also the Crown Princess Victoria was given away by her father, the current King of Sweden, so there's also that major precedent. I don't know if royal weddings have quite the same impact in Sweden as they do in the UK, but...
I did want to ask you both in concluding, and you don't have to name any names and you can fudge some details, locations, times, places, but have either of you, I will ask you first, Ben, ever attended a wedding which for whatever reason you found noteworthily strange, unusual or remarkable?
Oh, goodness. No, but but I will say at my own wedding, at which I married another man, we walked down the aisle together. So that was a new tradition, I suppose. Yeah.
Tessa?
That's strange in a good way.
yeah, of course. Yeah.
But I think, my own wedding was certainly strange for me, highly strange, but also a lot of fun, but rather more traditional. And I think that's the interesting thing. If you already said you get married, which nobody needs to do, and it wasn't sort of my idea also. But if you do it, then you can also go full everything if you want. I think these American weddings with these silly bridesmaids and dresses and all this, if somebody wants to do that, I think a party is a party, and people shouldn't be too sort of stiff upper lip about anything and just go for it.
Well, on that upbeat do what thou wilt note, Tessa Szyszkowicz and Ben Kelly, thanks for joining us. And finally on today's show, this Saturday's Foreign Desk will include several highlights from our recent visit to the GlobeSec Forum in Prague, including an interview with Ukraine's former Defence Minister Alexei Reznikov. And all this week we're playing other interviews we collected at GlobeSec, including this one with Dr. Mansour Al-Marzouki, Director of the Centre for Strategic Studies at the Prince Saud Al Faisal Institute for Diplomatic Studies in Riyadh. Though the Middle East was not top of the agenda of a gathering understandably preoccupied with Ukraine, there was some discussion of it, and I began by asking Dr. Al-Marzouki if the recent Abraham Accords between Israel and some of its Arab neighbours amounted to a realisation among those Arab countries that an alliance with Israel might be more important than the Palestinian cause.
First of all, there is a difference between partnership and an alliance. An alliance is a legally binding state of affairs between two or more state actors. That has never been the case in the Middle East between Israel and any other state actors. I'm not even aware that Israel itself has, technically speaking, theoretically speaking, an alliance with any of its Western partners. It has some security arrangements, but I think there is an argument to be made about how we characterize this arrangement. Point number two, the Abraham Accords took place in a context where state actors, let's take Morocco, for example, has an issue in some of its territories. So it was a bargain.
Is Western Sahara you're talking about?
Yes. So there is a bargain in that regard. I'm not sure how much of it concerns Israel and its state of apartheid or occupation. And number three, states such as middle-sized power, a major country such as Saudi Arabia, has always argued that we need a Palestinian state. And the official statements, I believe the phrase was, an irreversible path to a Palestinian statehood. So, and the last point, there has been a huge fog created around the Abraham Accords to make them look different from what they are in reality.
But do you think there's any chance at all, though, because it was being talked about a lot, as you know, certainly before October 7th, the inevitability of a normalization of relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Do you think that is actually really any less likely now than it was? Is it more likely the case that what we've seen on October 7th and since has just delayed what is inevitable?
The condition, well, first of all, the main considerations, strategic considerations, concern Saudi Arabia and the United States of America.
Sure.
Israel is not a major part of it. Israel is just there on the sidelines of it. But strategically speaking, it is an affair between Saudi Arabia and the United States for a number of strategic considerations that has to do with world transformations, with the rise of China, with economic increased presence of China and the region, the Arabian Gulf and the Middle East, etc. But Israel is on the side for a few number of reasons, some of which are internal politics in the US. So that's important to take into consideration. After the events of the October 7th, for the first time, in my view, the occupation of Palestine and the statehood of Palestine have become an internal political matter within a number of Western countries, chief among which is the US. If you look at elections, you have a number of movements that were created in response to the ongoing genocide and the ongoing US support of this genocide. You have the uncommitted voice, you have other trends within the Democratic Party, etc. In Germany, it has become an internal political issue, in the UK and France, etc. So these elements, in my view, are, despite the horrors that we have been witnessing, but may actually keep some hope that there is a new approach from the major powers towards the state of Palestine, the creation, the end of occupation and the creation of a Palestinian state. So this gives me some hope. With the insistence of major countries such as Saudi Arabia, I think we may be witnessing new trends vis-a-vis the question of Palestine.
I mean, it's possibly, well, if not a cynical question, then certainly a cynical premise underpinning the question that perhaps Saudi Arabia, other Arab interlocutors, think that the establishment of a Palestinian state might be an easier thing to accomplish if Israel has accomplished the task of more or less destroying Hamas. Because none of those Arab countries, Saudi Arabia especially, I mean, they weren't massive fans of Hamas. They're not really going to miss them, are they?
Not at all. Actually, Saudi Arabia has been in a state of animosity vis-a-vis Hamas. We have brokered peace deals, reconciliation efforts between Fatah and Hamas at the turn of the century, and they have not been faithful to what they committed themselves to. Other issues as well, being involved in different efforts against Saudi Arabian interests in the region, allying themselves with the adversaries of Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. But the issue here is not Hamas. It is the Palestinian people. And I believe that there is a strategic concept in Riyadh that stipulates that the lack of a Palestinian state creates strategic voids that are exploited by state actors as well as non-state actors, which work against stability in the region, but also, and this is a very important point, against Saudi Arabian interests. Hence, the creation of a Palestinian state satisfies those interests. It mitigates the risks of these strategic voids for Saudi Arabia. It is an essential element for Saudi Arabian national security. But this is only half of the consideration in Riyadh. The other is symbolic. Many people know that our attachment to Palestine go back only to the second Caliph Umar al-Khattab and the 7th century, but this is not true. During the time of the Qidar kingdom, 3,000 years ago, Palestine was part of our territories. The custodian of the two holy mosques, His Majesty King Salman, the current king of Saudi Arabia, has been militarily deployed in the 50s in defense of Palestine. The uncle of my mother is buried in Jerusalem. My oldest brother has been deployed in the Golan Heights for a number of years. And I am not an exception within the Saudi Arabian people. You have these symbolic, emotional, historical, civilizational elements, and there is this attachment, but without forgetting the strategic consideration. So we need a Palestinian state for strategic reasons and for symbolic reasons.
That was Mansour Al-Marzouki from the Prince Saud Al Faisal Institute for Diplomatic Studies speaking to me at the GlobeSec Forum in Prague. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Ben Kelly and Tessa Shishkovitz. Today's show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Sana Germani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.